My husband stood up in front of 200 of his co-workers, raised his glass, and joked that he finally understood what real ambition looked like now that he'd met someone actually going somewhere in life. His mistress standing 3 feet away from me in a dress I'd actually helped her choose months earlier, back when I still thought she was simply his new co-worker. What my husband didn't know, what almost no one in that ballroom knew, was that the quiet, unremarkable wife he just humiliated in front of his entire company was worth more than the company itself. Stick with me, because by the time that night ended, my husband didn't just lose his mistress. He lost everything he thought he'd built. My name is Camille Ashford. I'm 31 years old, and for reasons that will become clear, almost nobody in my daily life actually knows my last name carries any real weight. My father, Richard Ashford, built a logistics and shipping conglomerate from a single warehouse in the 1980s into a company now valued at over $4 billion. When he passed away 3 years ago, I inherited controlling ownership, though I've spent those 3 years running things quietly through a small executive team, using my mother's maiden name, Bennett, professionally and socially, specifically to avoid the complications that come with people knowing exactly how much money you're sitting on. I met my husband, Derek Holloway, at a coffee shop 4 years ago, long before he had any idea who my family was. He worked in mid-level marketing at a company called Winslow Consumer Goods, ambitious, charming, endlessly talking about his 5-year plan to make partner. I never told him about the Ashford fortune, not out of dishonesty, but because I genuinely wanted to be loved for myself first, and by the time I trusted him enough to tell him the full truth, we were already engaged, and something in me kept delaying the conversation, telling myself there'd be a better moment eventually. That better moment never came because somewhere around our 2nd year of marriage, Derek stopped being the man I'd fallen in love with. He grew distant, dismissive, increasingly focused on climbing the corporate ladder at Winslow, increasingly embarrassed, it seemed, by what he perceived as my quiet, unambitious life as a stay-at-home consultant, a vague professional title I used to explain my flexible schedule without revealing the actual scope of what I managed behind the scenes. I didn't know about Brooke Sinclair until 4 months before that office party. I didn't know how deep the betrayal actually ran until the night Derek stood in front of his entire company and used our marriage as the punchline to a joke about who actually deserved his ambition. To understand how thoroughly Derek misjudged the woman standing beside him that night, you have to understand the life I deliberately built to stay hidden. After my father passed, I made a decision that, looking back, probably contributed more to my marriage's unraveling than I wanted to admit at the time. Rather than stepping publicly into my father's role, becoming the face of Ashford Enterprises the way board members and investors initially expected, I hired a seasoned CEO named Jonathan Pierce to run daily operations, retaining controlling ownership and final decision-making authority myself, but staying almost entirely out of public view. I told myself I was protecting Derek and our marriage from the complications that come with sudden, enormous wealth, the assumptions people make, the way money changes how others treat you, the fear, honestly, that Derek himself might change if he knew the truth too soon or too suddenly. I told myself I was protecting our relationship's authenticity, the same reasoning I'd used years earlier when I first met him and chose not to mention my family's business at all. In hindsight, I think I was also protecting myself from a fear I never fully admitted, that Derek's love, however genuine it felt in our early years, might have been at least partially built around ambition itself, around what I represented rather than who I actually was, and that revealing the full truth too early might have accelerated exactly the kind of dynamic I eventually found myself trapped inside anyway. I spent my days working quietly through calls with Jonathan, reviewing quarterly reports, making strategic decisions about acquisitions and expansions that occasionally made business news under Ashford Enterprises' name, a name Derek never once connected to me, since I'd legally used my mother's maiden name, Bennett, in every professional and social context throughout our entire relationship. Derek, meanwhile, grew increasingly consumed by his own ambitions at Winslow Consumer Goods, working late hours that gradually stopped feeling like genuine overtime and started feeling, to my growing unease, like deliberate distance. He'd come home distracted, dismissive of questions about his day, increasingly critical of small things about our life together. The modest house I'd chosen deliberately to maintain a normal-feeling existence, the unambitious nature of my vague consulting work, the way I didn't seem to want more out of life, in his words. I didn't realize during those months of growing distance that more for Derek had started to mean someone else entirely, someone whose ambition matched the version of himself he desperately wanted to become. Derek introduced Brooke Sinclair to me for the first time at a company barbecue nearly 8 months before that office party, describing her simply as the new director of client relations at Winslow, someone he'd been working closely with on a major account restructuring. Brooke was polished in a way that felt deliberate, ambitious in the specific visible way Derek had started openly admiring in conversation, the kind of woman who talked about 5-year goals and executive tracks with the confidence of someone who'd never once had to hide a single part of her own story. She was charming to me that day, complimentary about my dress, asking thoughtful questions about my consulting work that I answered vaguely, the way I always did, never suspecting anything beyond normal workplace friendliness. Over the following months, Brooke's name started appearing more frequently in Derek's conversation, always framed professionally at first. A shared project, a client dinner, a conference they'd both attended together. I noticed slowly the way Derek's phone had started staying face down more often, the way certain evening work calls happened behind closed doors, the way Heisel's distance from me seemed to correlate directly with his growing enthusiasm whenever Brooke's name came up. I found the first concrete evidence almost by accident, for months before the office party, when Derek left his laptop open while showering and I noticed, not through snooping exactly, but through simply glancing at the screen while walking past, a string of messages with Brooke that made the nature of their relationship unmistakably clear. Messages about missing each other after work trips. Messages that reference physical intimacy in language that left absolutely no room for professional interpretation. I didn't confront him immediately. Something in me, some instinct sharpened by years of managing complex business situations carefully rather than reactively, told me to gather full clarity first, to understand exactly what I was dealing with before deciding how to respond. Over those 4 months, I documented everything quietly, the way I'd learned to document any significant business decision throughout my years overseeing Ashford Enterprises from behind the scenes. Dates, patterns, evidence, all while Derek remained completely unaware that the wife he considered unambitious and beneath his growing aspirations was simultaneously building an airtight understanding of exactly how deep his betrayal actually ran. 3 weeks before the office party, Derek mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Winslow Consumer Goods was hosting its annual company gala, and that spouses were expected to attend. I could tell, even before he said it, that he wasn't particularly enthusiastic about my presence there. "It's mostly executives and their partners," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "You don't have to feel obligated to come if it's not really your scene." I told him calmly that I'd be happy to attend, watching something flicker across his face that I recognized now, with the clarity of 4 months of quiet documentation, as genuine discomfort rather than simple disinterest. He didn't push back further, though likely calculating that outright refusing to bring me would raise more questions among his colleagues than simply managing my presence carefully once we arrived. I spent those 3 weeks preparing in ways Derek couldn't have anticipated. I contacted Jonathan Pierce, my CEO, and mentioned casually that I'd be attending an event connected to Winslow Consumer Goods, a company that, as it happened, had recently become the subject of acquisition interest from one of Ashford Enterprises' subsidiary divisions, interest I'd been quietly evaluating for several weeks entirely independent of anything related to Derek. The timing, once I recognized it clearly, felt almost surreal. Winslow's leadership team, the very executives whose approval Derek had spent years chasing, was scheduled to meet with Ashford representatives the following month to discuss a potential majority stake acquisition, an acquisition I, as controlling owner, would have final authority to approve or reject. I made a decision during those 3 weeks that surprised even me. I wasn't going to reveal my identity through some dramatic announcement or staged reveal. I was simply going to attend that gala exactly as Derek expected, quiet, unremarkable, easily dismissed, and let whatever happened that night unfold naturally, trusting that Derek's own behavior, unfiltered by any awareness of who he was actually humiliating, would reveal precisely the kind of man he'd become. I had no idea, walking into that ballroom in a modest navy dress Derek had specifically suggested as appropriately understated, exactly how thoroughly he'd confirm every quiet suspicion I'd spent 4 months carefully documenting. The gala was exactly the kind of polished, self-congratulatory corporate event I'd attended dozens of times throughout my life, though always previously as Camille Ashford rather than as Derek Holloway's unassuming wife. I recognized the type of room immediately. Crystal chandeliers, an open bar, executives networking loudly while their spouses made careful small talk in clusters around the edges of the room. Derek stayed close to me for the first 20 minutes, introducing me briefly to a handful of colleagues before drifting, almost immediately, toward a cluster of people that included Brooke Sinclair, stunning in a deep emerald dress, laughing easily with several senior executives in a way that made her presence in that room feel less like an employee's and more like someone already being groomed for something bigger. I watched from a polite distance as Derek's entire demeanor shifted around her. More animated, more confident, more visibly the ambitious version of himself he'd always wanted to project. I recognized, watching them together, the exact dynamic I'd suspected for months. This wasn't simply a physical affair. Derek had built an entire alternate life around Brooke, one where he felt like the successful, admired man he'd always aspired to become, free from whatever insecurities my quiet, understated presence apparently triggered in him. The evening proceeded through dinner, awards, executive speeches, standard corporate gala choreography I'd witnessed countless times before. It wasn't until the closing toasts, when the CEO of Winslow invited several senior team members to say a few words, that Derek, visibly several drinks into the evening, unexpectedly grabbed a microphone himself, ostensibly to say a few words about ambition and growth that had defined his year. I felt something tighten in my chest as he began speaking, some instinct warning me that whatever came next wasn't going to be the harmless toast he clearly believed he was delivering. Derek's toast started innocuously enough, thanking his team, mentioning a few professional milestones from the past year. But somewhere in the middle of his remarks, loosened by alcohol and clearly emboldened by Brooke's presence just a few feet away, his tone shifted into something far more personal, far more careless. "You know," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Brooke with his champagne glass, "this year taught me something important about ambition, about what it actually looks like when someone genuinely wants more out of life." He paused for effect, the kind of pause a man makes when he thinks he's being clever rather than cruel. "I finally understand what real drive looks like, now that I've met someone actually going somewhere in her career, instead of just settling." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room, several people glancing toward me with expressions caught somewhere between confusion and second-hand embarrassment. Derek continued, oblivious or indifferent to the discomfort his words were creating, making another comment about some people being content coasting through life, while others actually chase what they want, language that left absolutely no ambiguity about who he was comparing, and in whose favor. I stood there, in that navy dress he'd specifically requested I wear because it was understated, watching my own husband publicly humiliate me in front of 200 of his colleagues, using his mistress as the explicit standard against which he just declared me insufficient. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. I felt instead that same familiar calm I'd relied on throughout years of high-stakes business negotiations, a clarity that settles over me precisely when the stakes become significant enough that emotional reaction would only cloud what needed to happen next. I caught Jonathan Pierce's eye across the room. He'd attended that evening specifically as part of Ashford's due diligence process regarding the potential Winslow acquisition, a detail Derek had absolutely no awareness of. Jonathan, watching the toast unfold with visible discomfort of his own, offered me a small, questioning nod, silently asking whether I wanted him to intervene. I shook my head almost imperceptibly. Not yet, I thought. Let him finish digging. After Derek's toast concluded to scattered, uncomfortable applause, he returned to our table, still visibly pleased with himself, apparently unaware or unbothered by how his words had landed across the room. I let him sit down beside me, let him reach for his drink with the easy confidence of a man who genuinely believed he'd just delivered something clever rather than devastating. "I think it's time you knew something," I said quietly, my voice steady in a way that immediately caught his attention, something in my tone clearly different from anything he'd heard from me before. Jonathan approached our table at that moment, exactly as we'd silently agreed, greeting me formally. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for the surrounding tables to hear clearly, "the acquisition team wanted me to confirm you're still planning to finalize your review of Winslow's leadership structure next week, given tonight's observations." I watched Derek's face shift through several stages of confusion in rapid succession, first at the unfamiliar name, then at the word acquisition. Then, as the pieces began assembling themselves, at something approaching genuine horror. "Ashford," he repeated slowly, staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "As in, Ashford Enterprises. As in my father's company." I said calmly. The company I've owned outright for the past 3 years. The company currently evaluating a majority acquisition of Winslow Consumer Goods, based largely on leadership assessments I've been conducting personally, including tonight. The color drained visibly from Derek's face as nearby executives, overhearing enough of the conversation to understand its significance, began exchanging alarmed glances of their own. Brooke, seated at a nearby table, went noticeably pale as well, the ambitious confidence she'd carried all evening evaporating into something considerably less certain. "You never told me," Derek said, his voice cracking between disbelief and something that sounded absurdly like betrayal of his own. "No," I agreed. "I wanted to be loved for who I actually was, not for what I represented. Tonight, in front of everyone, you made it very clear exactly how little that mattered to you." News of that evening spread through Winslow Consumer Goods with the speed such stories always travel through corporate environments once enough witnesses are involved. Within days, it became common knowledge throughout the company that Derek Holloway had publicly humiliated his wife at the annual gala, unaware she controlled the very company evaluating Winslow for potential acquisition. Jonathan Pierce, working alongside Ashford's acquisition team over the following weeks, conducted a thorough leadership assessment as part of standard due diligence. An assessment that, given the circumstances, understandably included careful scrutiny of workplace conduct and professional judgment among Winslow's senior staff. Derek's public behavior that evening, combined with documented concerns about an inappropriate workplace relationship with a direct professional connection, factored directly into recommendations Jonathan ultimately presented to Winslow's board. Winslow's CEO, eager to preserve the acquisition deal given the company's financial position, moved quickly to address the situation internally. Derek was placed on administrative leave within 2 weeks, officially pending an internal review of workplace conduct policies. Though everyone involved understood the review's outcome had effectively been determined the moment Ashford's team flagged the incident as a liability concern for the acquisition. Brooke Sinclair, whose own position had been built partly around her visible ambition and client relationships, found her professional reputation similarly damaged once colleagues began openly discussing the affair's role in the gala incident. She resigned from Winslow entirely within a month, reportedly struggling afterward to secure comparable positions elsewhere in the industry, given how quickly reputational concerns travel through close-knit professional circles. I didn't personally orchestrate their professional downfall, not directly. I simply allowed the natural consequences of Derek's own public behavior, combined with legitimate due diligence concerns any responsible acquiring company would have flagged regardless of my personal involvement, to unfold according to standard business practice. But I won't pretend I didn't feel a certain grim satisfaction watching a man who'd humiliated me for supposedly lacking ambition lose his career specifically because his own ambition had blinded him to exactly who he was dismissing. The Winslow acquisition proceeded successfully over the following months, ultimately strengthening Ashford Enterprises' position within the consumer goods sector considerably, an outcome entirely separate from my personal circumstances, but one that made the professional consequences Derek faced feel, in some strange way, like appropriate symmetry. The divorce proceedings moved relatively quickly, given that our prenuptial agreement, something I'd insisted on early in our engagement specifically to protect Ashford Enterprises' ownership structure regardless of how our marriage ultimately unfolded, left little room for prolonged financial disputes. Derek received a modest settlement reflecting the modest, deliberately understated lifestyle we'd shared throughout our marriage, an amount that, while fair, bore no resemblance to the fortune he'd unknowingly been married into for 4 years. I moved out of the house we'd shared, purchasing a property that finally reflected more of who I actually was rather than the careful understated persona I'd maintained throughout my marriage. I stepped gradually into a more visible role at Ashford Enterprises, no longer feeling the same need to hide behind my mother's maiden name now that the specific relationship I'd been protecting had definitively ended. The transition wasn't purely triumphant. I spent considerable time in the months following the divorce, processing genuine grief over the marriage I'd believed I was building, separate entirely from the financial and professional consequences Derek faced. Being wealthy doesn't inoculate a person against heartbreak, against the particular sting of discovering someone you loved considered you insufficient specifically, because you deliberately hidden the parts of yourself that might have changed his perception. Jonathan Pierce remained a steady, professional presence throughout this transition, eventually becoming someone I trusted not just with Ashford's daily operations, but with the kind of honest feedback few people in my position typically receive from employees dependent on their continued employment. He told me once, during a particularly difficult week, that the version of myself he'd watched navigate that gala evening, calm, strategic, unwilling to let emotion override clear judgment, represented exactly the kind of leadership Ashford Enterprises had been missing during my years of quiet behind-the-scenes management. I started slowly, allowing myself to be fully seen for the first time in years, both professionally and personally, no longer managing a careful separation between who I actually was and who I presented to the world. It felt uncomfortable initially, exposed in ways 4 years of careful concealment had never required. But it also felt increasingly like genuine freedom. A year after that gala, I stood in the same city, at a different event entirely, an industry gala hosted by Ashford Enterprises itself, one I attended fully and publicly as Camille Ashford, controlling owner and increasingly visible face of a company my father had spent decades building. I heard occasionally, through mutual industry connections, updates about Derek's life since the divorce. He'd found work eventually at a smaller firm, considerably less prestigious than Winslow, still apparently telling a carefully edited version of our marriages ending to anyone who'd listen, one that conveniently minimized his own public humiliation of me in favor of framing himself as somehow blindsided by my secret wealth. I didn't feel the need to correct that narrative publicly. I'd learned, over the years since our divorce, that the people who mattered most in my life, Jonathan, a small circle of genuine friends I'd cultivated separate from my marriage, eventually even a few colleagues who'd witnessed that gala evening firsthand, understood exactly what had actually happened that night, understood precisely why Derek's public humiliation of me had revealed far more about his character than my careful concealment of my family's wealth ever could have revealed about mine. Standing in that ballroom, finally fully visible as myself, I thought about the version of me who'd stood quietly beside Derek exactly 1 year earlier, absorbing his casual cruelty in front of 200 witnesses, calmly calculating rather than emotionally reacting, because reacting in that moment would have cost me the clarity I needed to handle what came next with precision rather than impulse. I raised my own glass that evening during a brief address to Ashford's assembled executives and partners, and spoke simply about the kind of leadership and character I intended to build the company's future around: patience, genuine respect, the willingness to see people clearly rather than dismissing them based on surface-level assumptions about ambition or worth. I didn't mention Derek by name. I didn't need to. Everyone in that room who'd heard the story, in whatever version had reached them, understood exactly what I meant, and exactly why I'd earned the right to say it.